Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Petoskeys. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the table tonight, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is Mr. Useful Human, Mr. Seattle Twitter. He is Arif Hassan. Arif, welcome to Seattle.
Hey, you like being in Seattle. This city's actually pretty fun. I like it.
And we are coming live from Petoskeys in Seattle. Isn't that right, everybody? We have a ton of people here. Thank you guys so much. It really means a lot to us. We picked Seattle for two reasons. One, because we knew it was going to be an interesting game, and two, because there seems to be a strange influx of people from the North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin area out here. Whether it be through Amazon or other illicit means, everyone seems to kind of find their way into this general area. So thank you guys so much for coming out. And Petoskeys is such a fantastic place to have this. I was commenting that I flew like 1,400 miles today to go into a bar and set up equipment and watch the UND Gopher hockey game on the TVs. That is fantastic. That is something I want in my Seattle bars. So, again, thank you guys so much for joining us in person. Thank you guys so much for joining us online. We have plenty of stuff to talk about, including the will he, won't he saga of Adam Thielen as to whether or not he will end up playing. We have a bit to talk about as far as the preview itself, and of course we have the mailbag, and we'll also be taking questions from the audience during the mailbag as well. So, but before we begin, just want to thank you guys so much for listening, for sharing the link on social media, for doing whatever it is that you do with Norse Code, whether you play it for your spouse, or whether you listen to it on the streets of this city that make no goddamn sense. I found myself at a 7-way stop in Westlake today, and I just went, what the hell are you people doing? This is a road for like logs rolling down the hill and nothing else. But you endeavor to persevere. But again, thank you guys so much. If you are interested in donating to the show, as I've gone over a million times, you can do so at paypal.me/NorseCode or patreon.com/NorseCode. This will be the last time that I mention the Patreon thing for right now, because the $3.50 promotion, the Tree Fitty for swag, will be up at the end of November. So if you're interested in such a thing, by December 1st, please go and donate to Norse Code at patreon.com/NorseCode. All right, all of the shilling aside, Norse Code Nessie is here. I made a big deal about Norse Code Nessie's appearance last live show, and then I forgot him. So Norse Code Nessie is here. First things first, Arif, so you're enjoying the Seattle experience so far? I've heard rumors that you own a house here.
I don't own a house here. I'm staying at an Airbnb, which I was informed earlier today used to just be the garage of another house. But it's got it, like they replotted, it's got its own land. The address, you can't find it on Google Maps. It was very exciting. You have to they emailed me a set of instructions to get there, and I had to go through like a set of alleys, but it is a legitimate address at the same time. The city planning thing, I was not anticipating this.
Well, and we had talked before the show about the idea that, Jesse Ventura got in a lot of trouble for saying that that St. Paul was laid out by a bunch of drunken Irishmen. But I became of the belief that it's entirely possible that those people ended up coming and getting like ideas from the Seattle area. Like I'm that 7-way stop really did just burn me for a moment. I don't know what's going on here.
That's all you're going to talk about for the next month.
Dude, it was a 7-way stop! How do you do that? Even when I'm at the corner of University and University in the Cedar neighborhood.
You mean at 7 Corners?
Yeah, I'm at 7 Corners. Yes, thank you. Even when I'm doing that, it made absolutely no sense, but okay, fine. So let's get into the show. Normally we have a guest to preview the Seahawks, but unfortunately with the Thanksgiving weekend and everything, we don't have a proper guest. But I feel that we have one already. We have somebody who is very familiar with the Seahawks. We have Arif Hassan here.
Why not?
Who is able to give us all the information that we're going to need on the Seahawks and what the Vikings are going to need to do in order to beat them. So, Arif, I suppose the first thing that we want to mention is the fact that Russell Wilson seems to be going on a bit of a hot streak, trying to, and is definitely in the MVP conversation. And the Vikings seem to be ripped off a lot when it comes to long runs, long plays, especially in the passing game. This seems like the person the Vikings are really going to need to focus on.
Yeah, well, when you look at the Seattle Seahawks offense, I mean, it's easy to pay attention to DK Metcalf, the rookie that has made a bunch of explosive plays. He had 3 drops last week. He's had a number of fumbles this year. Obviously, Tyler Lockett's very talented, but you take a look at the offensive line, you take a look at the running game, you take a look at the receiving core, and the core of the Russell Wilson MVP argument is really the fact that his supporting cast isn't up to the level of the supporting cast of the other MVP candidates. So you take a look at Lamar Jackson in Baltimore, they've got a much better supporting cast. You take a look, Kirk Cousins here in Minnesota has a much better supporting cast. And Russell, I think, is doing a lot more by himself. And so obviously he's kind of the focal point. The problem with a quarterback being the focal point is that doesn't really tell you much about game planning because, you have to stop the passing game, great. So the idiosyncrasies of the quarterback really matter a lot, and unfortunately, he's exactly the type of quarterback that the Vikings have a lot of trouble with. Obviously, he's got great scrambling ability. He has the ability to take advantage of open lanes, and his ability to kind of improvise on the run really can complicate any sort of defensive coverage setup that the Vikings have, especially as the receivers continue to become familiar with what Russell Wilson wants to do. Their ability to kind of improvise with him makes it more difficult as the season goes on, and that's been true for Russell Wilson for the past several years, where he kind of gets on the second half of the season in much the same way he gets on in the fourth quarter. He's much better in the second half of the season, I think, because the rest of the offense is getting in sync with what he's trying to do. So it is a difficult way to game plan to say, hey, this quarterback is the guy who's going to be the person you have to stop. That means you can't really focus on double teaming any receiver. That means you can't focus on creating a specific rush plan. In fact, the Vikings might want to reduce their aggressiveness when rushing the passer because of all the problems that come with rushing Russell Wilson, which I think a lot of people remember from the playoff game.
Yeah, and it's, Russell Wilson isn't some sort of a surprise for Minnesota Vikings fans. We've been watching him, and the Vikings seem to play the Seahawks more often than not, it seems, in recent years. So it's not like this is a team that is any sort of a surprise to us. Plus, this is coming at a time when, let's face it, the cornerback play for Minnesota has been spotty, I think, is the nice word I can use to describe that.
Yeah, there's problems with the secondary play. Obviously, Xavier Rhodes, Trey Waynes are not really living up to what the Vikings need them to. I think especially Xavier Rhodes. I still think both of them are playing a little bit better than they're given credit for, and the scheme is not doing a ton to help them. But either way, the problem here is the shape or design of the Seattle offense. They pass the ball deep a little bit more often than almost any other offense in the NFL, specifically go routes. They pass on those deep streaks more often than any other team. I think it's 16.7% of Russell Wilson's targets this year have been on go routes, which is more than any other team in the league. And a lot of it obviously has to do with the physical capabilities they have at receiver, but they've been doing this since 2015, where their emphasis on those streaks, and not post routes, not corner routes, but specifically just straight down the field or double moves to go straight down the field, that kind of relies on just the physical capability of those receivers. A lot of people look at DK Metcalf's abilities and say, hey, he's going to be kind of a difficult matchup. He does kind of match the profile of somebody who in the past Xavier Rhodes has been able to shut down. He doesn't have a ton of lateral agility. He's not a refined route runner. In the past, Rhodes has been able to shut down those kinds of receivers, kind of regardless of the amount of speed that they've had. Obviously, this year, there's some questions about that. He did a pretty good job against Julio Jones, but the Vikings have decided not to have him shadow receivers for most of the year for a reason. So the problem is, I think, magnified because when you put those corners on an island and the fact that those corners aren't as skilled as they typically are, it will initially be a good matchup for the Vikings. This year, it might turn out to be a pretty poor matchup unless they kind of change what those safeties are doing to kind of double those receivers. The Seahawks this year are in 3 receiver sets a lot more often than they've been in previous years, so it's really difficult to design a coverage that will account for those deep threats. But for the most part, I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings decided to just plaster Rhodes on Metcalf, just kind of see what happens. It didn't really work very well with Courtland Sutton. But I wouldn't be surprised. Metcalf is not as good of a contested catch receiver as Cortland Sutton. I wouldn't be surprised if they tried that again.
So you have Metcalf, but you also have Tyler Lockett, who has had a couple of really nice games too. So if you end up tossing Rhodes or the corpse of Xavier Rhodes out there on Metcalf, are you going to trust Hughes on Lockett, or are we going to end up expecting Trey Waynes to attempt to blanket that up?
So Lockett's clearly the better receiver. The problem is that he can win in a number of ways. So obviously he's a very agile receiver. He's great at route running in terms of his technical skill, but he also has the ability to win in contested catch situations. He's got, I think, a lot more strength than his frame would imply. And so matching up against Trey Waynes, the problem there is that Waynes isn't great against shifty receivers in much the same way Rhodes is. Mike Hughes has the best skill set to deal with Lockett. He doesn't have as much speed as Lockett does, but that's somebody you'd kind of trust there. Unfortunately, Hughes is obviously he's coming off of a pretty bad week, so it's difficult to say, hey, Hughes is the matchup here, just because you don't know kind of which Hughes you're getting. Obviously, at the beginning of his rookie year, people were pretty excited about what he was doing. Zimmer's praised him more than any other rookie cornerback he's ever had over the course of his history, going all the way back to Dallas. But that game that Mike Hughes had, I think kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth. I still think that's the best move. I don't think that's what the Vikings will do. I think they'll go with Trey Waynes because I think they like having those starters at corner, Trey Waynes and Xavier Rhodes, even if they're underperforming. Zimmer mentioned that right before the bye week, he was going to take a look at what they were doing in pass coverage and try and change some things to try and figure out what'll work for them and what won't. After they got back from the bye week, we asked him, hey, what have you kind of decided? Obviously, he wasn't going to give us a ton of detail, but he decided that they were going to do a couple of different things to try and give help to those corners and change schematically what they're doing. I'm kind of excited to see what that'll look like. The last couple of times that Zimmer has changed the scheme to accommodate his corners, the defense has taken a pretty significant turn for the better. I think the biggest example of that is after Week 4 last year. The Vikings were in cover 3 a lot, and they were getting exposed. Obviously, a lot of people remember the Rams game where you ended up with receivers on Anthony Barr a lot. You ended up with tight ends running deep downfield against Eric Hendricks, and the Vikings switched back to a cover 4 scheme, and that kind of from Week 5 on, they ended up having one of the best pass defenses in the NFL. So I do trust Zimmer to be able to change the coverage to accommodate the talent that he has and kind of figure out what teams are doing against him. The problem is in previous years, he's always had the talent to take on any additional scheme. This year, we don't know if the cornerbacks really do have that kind of talent for any scheme change to have a significant effect. So that's kind of the weakness there. And I'm not going to say the Vikings are lucky. They planned for it. But the Vikings it is a good situation where the Vikings finally have an offense that can make up for the defense's deficiencies, because I think otherwise we'd be talking about kind of what we're going to do in a cap-strapped year and how they're going to fix when a defense kind of just falls apart, because they're still a top 10 defense, but it really doesn't feel like they've got the ability to stop anybody that's got a marginally good offense.
It is kind of an opposite situation for most Vikings fans to be watching a team that is bailed out by its offense as opposed to being bailed out by their defense year in and year out. It's a bit strange.
It's been a decade, I think, since then.
It's been a decade, so it might have been the Favre era that we watched that happen. But at the same time that the receivers are going off, Chris Carson's been having a decent year.
He was. They benched him for a reason.
Well, yes.
No, so he's obviously a very creative runner. He's got a lot of capability to create yards after contact, to make runners miss. But he has seven fumbles this year. He's also unlucky in that I think most of them were recovered by the opposing team.
Those are Kirk Cousins' numbers. You can only do that.
Yeah, right, yeah.
You can only do that like 10 or 11 times before they put you on the bench.
Yeah, the Seahawks are in a weird spot where I think they're 4th in team fumbles this year. But they're the only team where I think over 50% of those fumbles come from running backs or receivers. Most teams, their fumble numbers come from the quarterbacks because, when you sack it, they're not trained to hold on to the ball. So the fact that most of their fumbles are coming from running backs, really significant, and it's kind of one of the interesting things about watching the Seahawks this year. They've been in 2 overtime games. 7 of their other 9 games have been within 1 score. The Seahawks really make it difficult for themselves. They've got a really talented team, but they're doing a lot to just make games close. They had a close game against an objectively bad team in Cincinnati. They've also had a really close game where they beat San Francisco. It's a very kind of weird environment, and those fumbles are a big part of it. They've turned to Rashad Penny, who has a lot of bad games and then has good moments. I don't really know what their plan for the running game is going to be going forward.
Other than Russell Wilson running?
Other than Russell Wilson running. But I think they're going to turn to Penny because they care a lot about ball security. He isn't free of fumbles either. So I'm not sure. Obviously, the Vikings are probably going to focus on trying to punch the ball out. The Seahawks are also very aggressive in trying to force fumbles, more so than most other teams. Instead of going for a clean tackle, they'll very much try to punch the ball out. And I think that's going to be kind of a focus for the Vikings because I think there's more opportunities had here on the running game in terms of creating turnovers than there are in terms of making sure you stop them 1 yard downfield. They'll be able to create those yards, especially if Chris Carson is in. But the issue is whether or not they'll be able to kind of hold on to the ball, and that's been an issue for them.
So I did want to mention, especially with the offense of the Seahawks, I wanted to stop on the 49ers thing simply because it was hard to tell, and I'm sure you watched the 49ers Seahawks game. It seemed to me that it was more of a situation of the 49ers beating themselves as opposed to Seahawks kind of overwhelming them. It seemed like Garoppolo just couldn't see 6 inches past his face by the end of the game, and whether that was more of a result of his kind of becoming frantic and the pocket disappearing, or was that a situation of Jadeveon Clowney and everybody kind of ganging up and taking advantage of him?
Well, so Clowney, I think, right now might be the best performing player on the Seahawks defense. Obviously, they've got Bobby Wagner. It's very difficult to say something like that. But I don't think Wagner's playing up to the level that he typically plays. He's still playing pretty well, but Clowney is playing at a really remarkable level. And so his presence in the 49ers game was obviously pretty tremendous. The reason that the Seahawks were comfortable trading for him and getting rid of Frank Clark, you'd hope it was for a moral reason, but the reason was schematic. It was because they really liked.
There's no morals in Seattle.
The reason was because they liked what Clowney was able to do in the run game in Houston, and his capability there has been pretty tremendous for them. The 49ers run game has been really tremendous. They've been able to put together a lot of really good, significant explosive runs, running a very similar scheme to the Vikings. But Clowney has been able to kind of help shut that down, and his presence, I think, was a big part of why the 49ers were imploded. It was still a close game, but they imploded a little bit. I think a lot of it's also that Jimmy Garoppolo is being carried a little bit by how tremendous that 49ers defense is, although I think there's kind of a lot there that makes them harder to defend too. So the Seahawks, they have a bunch of close games, and I think a lot of it's their fault.
What's the best way to kind of put a stop to this defense? This isn't an undefeated team by any stretch. How have teams had success against Russell Wilson and this team?
Well, I think some of it's taking advantage of those turnovers that they've been able to generate. So Wilson, he only has 3 interceptions this year. The turnovers usually occur on fumbles or sometimes a screw up on a kickoff or something like that. But a lot of it just comes from the fact that the Seahawks don't play efficient football. So they've got an MVP, candidate at quarterback, and they don't throw the ball very often. It's a little bit different than the Vikings, who, when they run the ball, they're one of the 8 teams in the NFL that generate positive expected points. The Seahawks are not one of the 8 teams, and so when they run the ball, they're very often hurting the team. So a lot of times they'll end up punting or end up in 4th down situations that they probably shouldn't be in because they ran it on 2nd and 11 or something like that, with a running back or a set of running backs that just aren't efficient enough to generate additional first downs. So sometimes teams are close to the Seahawks because the Seahawks aren't engaging in a lot of the explosive playmaking that they can do. And that's one of the reasons that Russell Wilson leads the league in game-winning drives. He has 5 this year. That's more than anyone else. And he has 4 fourth-quarter comebacks. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they keep games close because they don't have a ton of drives. They play a really slow game. They run the ball a lot more than they need to. And And because there's not a lot of possessions, the scores are close, and any team that can get within striking, and this almost happened to the Vikings last year too, any team that can get within striking distance usually does. And then they let Russell Wilson throw the ball, and he's playing really phenomenally, especially in fourth quarters. And he's playing really phenomenally throwing deep downfield, which is what they do a lot in the fourth quarter. And that's how they get away from or escape from teams. It's a really bizarre situation, but they've got a really old school coach. They like running the ball a lot. They think that helps their defense out a lot. It's not really helping out the defense a ton this year, but it's what's keeping other teams close, and it gives them more opportunities to get back. You take a look at what the Vikings did against them last year. They entered the fourth quarter down 6 points. It ended up being like 21-6, but a lot of that was just because of a bunch of fourth quarter mistakes. An interception of Justin Coleman turned into a pick six. A late running touchdown, I think off of another turnover. The Seahawks kept that game close too, and last year I think they were a much better team than they are this year. Their point differential doesn't say that they're a really phenomenal team. They've got a really great record, but that usually kind of catches up to teams. So teams are close to the Seahawks in part because the Seahawks don't have a great supporting cast. That offensive line's problem, again, like it always is. It's better than it has been in the past, but it just continues to be a problem. But also the Seahawks are just not maximizing the personnel that they have.
So let's talk about the Minnesota Vikings offense and how Kirk Cousins has been playing. Obviously, we were able to squeak by a very close victory that would have been a much worse loss than it was a cheap victory. So Kirk Cousins against this defense, how do you feel like this is going to go? Are they going to be susceptible to his brand of play action?
I think so. Their defense against play action this year has not been really tremendous, and I think a lot of that is because play action tends to put more stress on the cornerbacks and tends to get rid of the impact that a defensive line has. And so Seattle's had a pretty good defensive line for a number of years. This year it looks a lot different. But again, because Clowney seems to be their best performing player this year, a lot of their defensive success is being kind of pushed through the amount of pressure that they generate. Their cornerbacks this year just haven't been as good. Obviously, Shaquille Griffin is their kind of their best player in their secondary. Now that they've traded for Quandre Diggs, that may not be the case. But I think that's a problem for them because he's a really good cornerback too. I don't think he's a highlight cornerback one. And so when you put him up against these high-level receivers like, say, Stephon Diggs, I think that's a mismatch for them. And so I think play action does put the Vikings in a really good spot because it isolates that mismatch, and I think it gives them a lot more opportunities downfield. Now, they've got Bobby Wagner, they've got KJ Wright, they've got the ability at linebacker to better handle those short play action passes the Vikings seem to like a lot. But I think they'll try for those explosive plays because the Seahawks have been, as soon as they can't generate a pass rush, they've been vulnerable to those explosive plays, and so they've been really dependent on what that front four or front five can do. They've got like some other pretty good players. Rasheem Green's a pretty good run defender. Quentin Jefferson's played pretty well. I think he's got 2.5 or 3 sacks this year. Poona Ford is somebody that I like coming out of the draft a lot. He's performed really well for them as an undrafted free agent. They seem pretty excited about Ezekiel Ansah, and he's got production, but I think he makes a lot of mistakes too, so I don't know if that he's somebody that really generates a ton for them. But really, it's driven a lot more by that front four. And then recently, this last game we saw Shaquem Griffin go off. He's played basically every position in college and in the NFL. But in college at UCF, he was primarily an edge defender, despite the fact that he weighed like 220 pounds. Now the Seahawks are using him at the edge a little bit more often, and we saw a lot of success for him at the edge. And so maybe this next game we're going to see him a lot too. Maybe see if he's got the ability to generate additional pressure for them. And maybe that's one way they'll probably get rid of play action as well.
So the next thing I want to mention is we have 2 big names on the injury report that appear to be coming back as full participants, or at least one appears to be confirmed in Dalvin Cook, who had a bit of a chest injury, which it was initially reported as a potential shoulder, and then it's being listed in the injury report as chest. Is that right? Yeah.
So they don't give a bunch of details other than the fact that it was like that physical part of the body. But I know he was feeling a lot of pain in his shoulder during the bye week. As far as I understand, the injury is really just, the concern is really just in terms of pain management. It won't affect his ability to carry the ball or anything like that. It probably won't prevent him from lowering his shoulder to initiate contact. So it's really more a pain management issue. I imagine if there was no bye week, he would still play the regular amount of snaps he would normally play. But he was listed as limited on the Thursday practice report. The Vikings did not practice on Thursday. The Thursday practice report is an estimation of who would practice and who would not practice that day. They did have a little bit of practice on Wednesday, so I imagine they're using that as part of the information for their Thursday practice. But yeah, I don't think that one's a big concern. The other one you're probably going to bring up is Adam Thielen.
Indeed.
Limited again in today's practice. They seem pretty optimistic that he'll play, though. They don't think it'll be a game time decision, which is what happened in the Kansas City game. He felt good enough to go after 7 snaps. He apparently re-injured his hamstring or re-aggravated it in some way, and so he had to leave. They don't think this will be a game time decision, and I think that's probably optimistic, or that's a sign of optimism, rather. And so that means that he's very likely going to be a full participant. The problem is that receivers in general, after they get injured, for the rest of the season, their production tends to dip down. They're maybe the most injury-susceptible position in the NFL in terms of how much their production dips after they're listed as a full participant on the injury report. So we'll kind of see if that has an effect. I think him literally being on the field is going to have a pretty good effect, though. It'll prevent the...
Should draw defenders, too.
Right, exactly. It'll prevent the Seahawks from engaging in double and triple teams. Last year, with both of them on the field, the Seahawks still found ways to triple team Stephon Diggs and double team Adam Thielen on the same play. And so having Adam Thielen on the field is going to be, I think, pretty big just in terms of the way they can design their defense, because the Seahawks, again, they're a big cover 3, cover 1 defense again. A lot less this year than they have been most years, but 68% of snaps have been with a single high safety, so it's still kind of the same scheme. But they were willing to abandon that last year in order to double and triple team receivers. I imagine they would be more than willing to do that again and triple team Stephon Diggs, especially because even if Diggs can win on contested catches like that, Cousins just doesn't like to throw into double coverage, whether or not it's good for the Vikings. So
he prefers to either dump off to CJ Ham. I have no problems with this. As somebody who has purchased a Ham jersey, I don't own it, but he would not let me wear it to Seattle. I love my brother. If you're listening, Vic, I still want to wear that jersey sometime. But is that he either likes to dump it over there, or more recently, he seems to really enjoy sending it over to Kyle Rudolph.
Yeah, so a pretty big explosion in terms of production for Kyle Rudolph over the past 2 games. With 3-4 touchdowns, something like that. Not bad, but still, you're not going to get a bunch of between the 20 stuff. So if the Seahawks do decide to double team Diggs or even triple team him again, it'll be on B.C. Johnson, who obviously has been playing really well this year for being a 7th-round pick and a rookie. It'll be on him to generate more yardage. It'll be on Irv Smith, who's been getting more and more snaps. And then, of course, like you said, Kyle Rudolph. Although, again, I just don't think that – I mean, they'll probably match up KJ Wright to whichever tight end is on that side of the field. And if it's KJ Wright versus Kyle Rudolph, I'm probably not picking that matchup. So it'll probably be on a number of those other players. Plus, I mean, they seem confident enough in Laquan Treadwell that they cut Josh Doctson.
I was going to say, Laquan Treadwell beat someone out for a roster spot, which if you would have said that to me in training camp, I would have said we need to talk about dissolving this podcast. That seemed absurd to me.
He had a career high a couple weeks ago, 58 yards.
I was shocked. I don't understand it at all. But, I mean, Treadwell is apparently enough of a weapon where they decided they needed to cut the other bust from that draft. As far as wide receiver goes.
Yeah, plus he plays more special teams than Doctson does, so that helps.
Well, yes.
Yeah, he's demonstrated enough receiver skill to be rosterable. That's nice. I don't know.
Demonstrated enough to be rosterable.
That's the bar. Because he wasn't, right? They cut him.
Well, no, he stank on ice. That was the problem. He was atrocious, but
I don't think they'll be depending on him if they double or triple team Diggs. I think they'd just rather throw into triple coverage then.
Be like that, or make it over to Irv Smith and kind of call it good.
Right, yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings tried a lot more motion in this game.
I was going to ask about motion and screens, if this is a team that is going to be as susceptible to screens as, say, the Broncos were.
The Seahawks don't blitz as much as the Broncos. Well, actually, the Broncos don't blitz all that often. They show a lot of blitz looks. But the Seahawks don't blitz all that often compared to, like, the average team. And usually when they blitz, there's a zone look behind it. So typically screens are not going to be as good against teams that all their defenders have their eyes facing forward towards the quarterback. But I still think that in this specific instance, it's probably a good idea, just because there is a lot of over pursuit on that defense. Again, if Jadeveon Clowney is the person that you're worried about throwing screens to his side, we'll probably tire him out over the course of the game. Plus, it's going to make it difficult for him to be able to chase down those screens. Plus, I mean, it's Dalvin Cook, so at some point the matchup doesn't matter that much. He's just talented. And so you can win on those screens. I do think they'll probably do that because it'll force the cornerbacks to tackle. Again, this year the cornerbacks are just not as good as they have been in years past. I think in terms of tackling, that's one of the areas where they just haven't been as great. So I would expect to see a lot of screens. I think motions with Irv Smith are really good because the way Seattle likes to defend their pass rushers, they're very kind of gap sound, and so instead of rushing the passer first, they try to make sure they've got that run fit set up, and if you can kind of confuse those run fits with motion, you can actually slow down the pass rush against Seattle more than you can against a bunch of other teams, because they always try to make sure they can check who has what gap before they decide to move upfield, because they don't want to give up any rush lanes, even if it's like Kirk Cousins at quarterback.
They're not worried about Kirk Cousins scrambling for 50 or anything?
Well, I mean, they shouldn't be, but the way that they play, they're always worried about a quarterback scramble.
I thought I heard something about them updating Kirk Cousins' speed in Madden from 68 to 70 or something like that.
That's phenomenal. I love it.
Something like that. So is there anything else involving this matchup that we really should be paying attention to? Like some matchup, whether it be player on player or like a coverage scheme that the Vikings really should be worried about?
Well, I think one thing to note is that the Seahawks seem to be super injured.
Yay! Yeah. It's about time somebody is.
Yeah, right. So Dwayne Brown, their tackle, is limited. He was do not participate in their fake Thursday practice, but he's limited, and that could be a big problem because they'll be going against a pair of defensive ends that lead the league in pressures. Jadeveon Clowney has a core injury. He was a fake do not participate. He was limited in practice. Some of their backups were limited. Mike Iupati was a didn't participate in today's practice, so that's a problem. They've got Jacob Hollister, who was pretty good a couple of weeks ago on some deep shots for them, was limited in practice. Metcalf and Gordon, I totally forgot about Josh Gordon. Metcalf and Gordon are both full participants, but they were projected to be limited. And then they also, Poona Ford, who I just mentioned, didn't participate because of illness, which seems to be a problem because there's like 4 players on the injury report listed with an illness. But yeah, I mean, I just listed only half of those players. On the other half, there's twice as many on the injury report.
Yeah, that is...
it's extensive.
That is quite the MASH ward they've got going there.
Right, yeah.
That is quite ugly. All right, so let's wrap up the preview real quick, and let's go into the mailbag. And we do have a couple of questions to start about Arif. Knowing laughter from the audience, thank you. Kyle Slaby asks, does Arif seem happier than normal now that he is free to be with his people?
I am wearing flannel. There's that. No, I mean, I like Seattle a lot. I was back here in 2013. I was in Seattle. That was a lot of fun. And I'm back here again. I enjoy the city a lot. It's got a fairly similar vibe to Minneapolis in a lot of ways. I think it's like a very similar demographics. They're both tech cities, although Seattle obviously is a little bit more of a tech city. Yeah, I don't know. It felt kind of fun just wandering around the different neighborhoods. I didn't have to drive, so that probably helped.
Yeah, that a little bit, yeah. I will say that I enjoyed the moment I landed taking off my winter coat and just walking around with short sleeves on, like, oh my God, this is fantastic.
You madman.
Oh, I'm leaving 1.5 feet of snow hitting my hometown to come out to Seattle. This could not have been planned any better. Sorry, honey. Brian Jellerson asks, does Arif use VRBO or Airbnb to rent out his Seattle home when he's on vacation in Minnesota?
I don't have a secret home in Seattle. I live in Minnesota. Also, I just heard about VRBO. Verbo? Is that I don't know. I heard about it today. I got served a digital ad, so someone's paying attention to our mailbag.
I feel like Brian Jellerson, something about Brian Jellerson's emails just usually end up with
they populated by Google AdSense.
Exactly. Brian Jellerson might not actually be a person. He might just be Google AdSense. Also, do you think the Vikings are playing coy with Thielen's status, or do you think there's a real chance he won't play?
No, I don't think that. I think it's a situation where if they say that they're confident he's going to play, and the 15% chance he doesn't play, they just kind of look like idiots. So they just don't want to say anything because if he doesn't play, they just look bad. Also, it's it is better to hide whether or not a player is playing. I don't think it'll change Seattle's plans or anything like that. But I think they're genuinely saying they don't know because there is some chance that he won't play.
So here's somebody calling you out on your crap. Ollie says, if running backs don't matter and you can pick one up anywhere, how are 16 of the top 20 leading rushing players drafted in the first 3 rounds? I know I'm being a bit of a contrarian, as it's not normally that high, and Jackson is in there as a quarterback.
Right, yeah, so obviously Lamar Jackson doesn't count, so it's more like 15 of 20. But yeah, and it is not normally that high. Only 11 of 20 in 2017, 14 of 20 in 2018. But the issue is because teams run their first-round picks more than they run their sixth-round picks. They tend to give more opportunities to those first-round picks. In 2012, Trent Richardson was in the top 20 rushers. He wasn't good, but they gave him a lot of opportunities, and he ended up with a bunch of rushing yards. Also that year was Reggie Bush. It's not evidence that a top 3 pick produces, or a top first 2 days pick produces a running back that's necessarily better than running backs later. I mean, we know Trent Richardson tends to get we know that first round picks tend to get a lot of opportunity because Trent Richardson had 3 years where he was a primary starter for 2 different teams. So in 2019 those leaders include Leonard Fournette, who's been better this year but he's not that great, Carlos Hyde. We're seeing bad years from Sony Michel and Joe Mixon and David Montgomery, and they're in the top 20 in terms of total rushing yards. So saying that the top 20 rushers include, a bunch of first, second, and third round picks aren't that helpful. If you take a look at the top rushing offenses by expected points, only 8 of them produce positive expected points. The Vikings were one of them, but the top 2 rush leaders in rush value are quarterbacks, Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson. The number 4 offense in rushing has their rushing leaders was paid less than $2 million on his second contract. That's Carlos Hyde. The number 5 rushing offense is led by a 4th rounder. The number 8 rushing offense is led by an undrafted free agent. I think there's pretty good evidence that you can probably find running backs later in the draft, although the Vikings are pretty happy with the ones they found.
All right, we're going to do one more question like this, and then we're going to go to the audience if anybody has a question out here. The question from Ethan Hammerman is, pick one option. The other one is gone forever from your team and replaced with a replacement level player. Option A, your team has Dalvin Cook. Option B, your team has Diggs and Thielen.
Yeah, option B, easily, not close. Dalvin Cook, I think, is remarkable. I think that he's played better than, when I say running backs don't matter, I think there's sometimes occasional exceptions. I think Adrian Peterson in 2012 is an obvious exception. I think, though I wouldn't compare Dalvin Cook's this year to Peterson's that year, I think Cook is another good exception because he's been able to create more yards before contact than you'd expect a running back in his situation to create. He's created more yards after contact than most running backs in the NFL. So he's doing a lot that his offensive line and the scheme aren't doing that he's producing on his own. But the running game just doesn't matter as much as the passing game. And a replacement level running, so presumably that means you wouldn't get Alexander Madison either because he's probably above a replacement level running back. A replacement level running back probably would be able to produce 90% of those yards. A replacement level receiver would not be able to produce what Diggs has been able to do over the past 5 weeks.
All right, so is there anyone here that has a question for Arif and or wants to get into an argument with him? That is how we marketed part of this. So is there a question from the audience? And you can come up and speak into this. There we go.
All right, I just want to know, does winning our annual laydown game make you feel better about this team or different about this team?
So the question is, did breaking the curse against the Broncos make us feel better about the Vikings this year?
Yeah, I think so. So the biggest issue, it's the concern I had was not the curse that the Vikings generally have, although obviously that's always a concern. It was about Kirk Cousins' play in situational football. Last year in 2018, Cousins didn't produce any wins in a comeback situation. Obviously, week 2 against Green Bay, he produced the game-tying score. And honestly, they probably would have been able to do a lot more if Treadwell didn't create an interception. But for the most part, in fourth quarter situations where they had the ability to win, they weren't able to do it. And in training camp that year, they had a bunch of 2-minute drills against the defense, and they did it basically every day, a number of situational football drills, and they didn't win a single one of them. The offense lost every single 2-minute drill against the defense in the offseason. And then you go back to this year, and in 2019, the same thing was essentially happening. For the first, for all of training camp, they didn't win a single situational football drill against the defense. A lot of it had to do with false starts or sacks or whatever, but either way, the offense couldn't produce in 2-minute situations against the defense. And it wasn't until training camp was technically over and they got into just their regular offseason practice that they were able to finally win in a 2-minute situation against their own defense in practice. So this was a concern in practice. It was a concern all year with the offense just generally in terms of what they were able to do on the field. And so finally for them to be able to do it against the Denver Broncos, who entering the game had a top 5 defense by points per drive, I think it's pretty big. I think it's pretty tremendous. This is the first comeback win that Cousins has had in a Vikings uniform. And it demonstrated his ability to balance the two kind of instincts that he has, because he wants to be an aggressive quarterback, but he also wants to be a quarterback that does kind of the right thing by the textbook, that, this is what the defense gives me, this is what I'm going to take. And in 2-minute situations, the defense is explicitly giving you bad options to drain the clock. And so for him to be able to balance that against the Denver Broncos, I think is a pretty tremendous step. I don't know if we can take this and say that he's fixed, but I think it alleviates a lot of concerns about situational football for the Vikings. Now, the defense is not as good as it was, so they might be in that situation more often than they should be. And so even if you've improved in comeback situations, if you're in them more often, you're in a bad spot. So a little bit of both, but I think it's better that they didn't have another Bills game.
So before we do anything more, I can't help but notice that your drink is empty and my drink is empty. Is there any chance, I know that somebody had purchased a pitcher of hams specifically for the two of us. Is there any chance we can get that pitcher of hams over here?
No, skull shots.
I still have part of my skull shot. I'm nursing that thing. It was tasty. But shots and I don't go very well. So if we can get that pitcher of hams over here to remind me why I stopped drinking hams in college, that would be great. Minnesota Vikings FB asks, it feels like Zimmer's defenses have a good track record versus Wilson relative to other elite quarterbacks. Is this scheme a hard matchup for Wilson or just a low sample size?
So in one of those games, Wilson had a pretty elite showing, 12.37 adjusted yards per attempt. That was the regular season 2015 game. And then in the playoff game, obviously the Vikings defense looked pretty tremendous, but it was also like negative 20 out. So I don't know if I would count that as a good indication that the Vikings have the ability to stop him. Obviously, last year the Vikings did a pretty good job. They held him to a 50% completion rate, but more importantly, 72 total yards on 20 attempts. So plus an interception, although the interception was kind of weird. It was a scramble, threw it up. Eric Hendricks came down with it right at the goal line. But it was 1.35 adjusted yards per attempt, which is pretty tremendously bad for any quarterback, and obviously really bad for Russell Wilson. I don't know. I would throw out the playoff game, and so you'd say there's one really tremendous game that Wilson's had, one really poor game that Wilson's had. I don't know that there's anything about the Vikings defense that makes it particularly good against Wilson. Plus, I think given how aggressive, especially Everson Griffin is when rushing the passer and opening up rush lanes, I think that the ability to extend here it is, oh my God. The ability to extend plays is actually genuinely pretty bad for the Vikings defense, because it isolates those corners and receivers in those matchup situations. So I actually think it's kind of the opposite, and I think the track record is kind of an accident of having like a negative 20-degree game to play against.
Sorry, I'm working on something I learned in college.
How to pour a drink?
How to successfully pour this an overflowing pitcher without spilling and without too much head. There we go.
All right.
Start with that.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to ruin the quality.
You would not want to. Hams means quality.
That's what the extra M is for.
Exactly. I like how I was very careful with yours, and with mine I just said screw it. Yep, there's regret. All right. One more question here, and we'll go back to the audience. Are there really people who think Kirk is don't think Kirk is getting re-signed by the Vikings? Barring an end-of-season meltdown, it seems obvious that the organization and the coaches believe they can win with him, and that if the team makes the playoffs as they are expected to, the organization may be right to think that. Is that just how things look from afar, and hometown folks like Brad still think that...
Like Brad?
Well, he was going off on a rant earlier in the email about a question that Brad from BC had mentioned.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
they still think the Vikings are looking to draft a quarterback and replace Kirk. Will he be fully guaranteed in the $90 million to $100 million range? What do you guys think is the most likely scenario for Kirk? Re-signed at the end of this season, or playing 2020 for a new contract while the Vikings groom a successor?
That's super interesting.
That's very interesting for a number of reasons, yeah.
Yeah. So one issue with contract negotiations from here on out is that we don't have any idea what the salary cap is going to look like from 2021 onward. The last time, obviously there's a lockout in 2011, but the last time they renegotiated a CBA, the salary cap actually dropped by a couple $1 million. So you can't just expect the salary cap to expand. And so negotiating a new contract for especially for a quarterback is going to be really difficult. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Vikings wanted to wait as long as possible to see if there's movement on the CBA. Maybe it'll get resolved sooner rather than later. But I don't think the Vikings want to commit to Cousins before he can solve the playoff narrative, right? Like I think that if he fizzles out in the playoffs, they'll probably wait again on a contract, regardless of how true those narratives are for quarterbacks. But he's not a young quarterback, right? So I think grooming a successor is smart. I don't think that's what they'll necessarily do. But I don't think it's a lock that Cousins will, get an extension. If he does get an extension, it would definitely be in the $100 million range. I mean, he got $84 million guaranteed, last year, and so getting in the $100 million range for his next contract over the course of a 3-year contract is well within reason if we assume that the salary cap keeps expanding. But I don't know if they're as sold on Kirk in terms of guaranteeing another set of dollars versus anything else, especially because if they just give him a standard contract, they ruin their opportunity to maybe restructure his contract in different ways and extend him in a different way to create more cap room for another area of need. I think they're going to wait on Kirk's contract, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were just comfortable with Kirk having some form of leverage at the end of his contract versus trying to get ahead of that leverage right now, because I think they'd rather just he proved that he's got the ability to have leverage, because that usually means that he's done really well, and they'll be happy with having to pay hand over fist if he's already won them a Super Bowl. So I don't know that he's a lock.
I'm just envisioning the ceremony of unveiling the names in like the Ring of Honor if the Vikings win a Super Bowl, and it turns out that the entire roster just gets their names just the entire way through.
Just put C.J. Ham right next to Alan Page.
Listen, after C.J. Ham's 3 touchdowns in the Super Bowl, hey, fine. I'm all in on the Ham package. We've already determined that. Do we have another question from the audience to come up and ask something? Why don't you find your way up here and give you this here. We're going to get wait music next time, yeah.
Just want to say I've been listening to you guys for almost ever, and it's a great podcast you guys got. I want to know where you would rank Zimmer against the rest of the NFL coaches this year. And second question is, where would you rank Kirk Cousins against the rest of the NFL quarterbacks this year?
Thank you.
It's interesting. I did do some work on the Cousins question for a piece I wrote on how advanced statistics would rank the different quarterbacks this year, especially in the NFC. So I'll get to that one in a second because it's a little bit easier. The Zimmer one is tougher because a lot of people will look at in-game decision-making for how good a coach is, and I think that's probably the least important thing a coach does. I think being part of the talent evaluation process, finding a staff, developing a game plan, kind of determining what roles players have and stuff like that, those are all way more important than like how good you are at timeouts, because those things will determine whether or not those timeouts matter in the first place. So
See Andy Reid.
yeah, Andy Reid's a really good coach, and can't call a timeout.
He needs a 12. He needs a 12-year-old on the sidelines who plays Madden all day to be able to determine all sorts of time management. That's been his thing for 10, 15 years.
The Ravens basically have that. Like the Ravens got this 25-year-old undergraduate from Yale who played a lot of Madden, and he also like is an economist, right? Like but he played a lot of Madden, and they're like, "Should we go for it on 4th down?" And he's like, "Yeah, obviously." What do you?
I just like the idea that he's the guy that I'm playing at 3:00 in the morning. That's running Lamar Jackson for his 300th yard.
He sits right next to Greg Roman in the booth. And he talks to Harbaugh every week. He's like, okay, so these are the situations we said we would go for it. This is the situation we said we call a timeout. And then during the game, Harbaugh's like, are you sure we should go for it? And he condescends to the head coach. He's like, what do we talk about? You promised you would go for it here. And he's like, yeah, I did promise. All right, we'll go for it.
Can we get him mic'd up with the two of them?
Yeah.
I really want to hear the mic'd up between the two of them going, fine.
But and it's working. They've generated a ton of value on 4th downs. They're a fun team to watch, which is a measure of success, I guess. But yeah, could Zimmer use that? I think so. Could Andy Reid use that? Absolutely. But it's also like the least important thing, which is probably why you can get a kid from Madden to do it, right? So all of those other things, which are a big part of how coaches get to that spot in the first place, because if they're good at talent evaluation, if they're good at designing game plans and stuff like that, they're pretty good offensive or defensive coordinators. They've got a resume to be hired as a head coach. So with all of that in mind, how good is Zimmer at those other things? How good is he at week-to-week game plans? How good is he at talent evaluation? How good is he at surrounding himself with a good coaching staff? And I think everybody would probably agree he's near the top 5, if not in the top 5, in every one of those categories. And if those categories are more important than like in-game management, then he's probably a top 5 head coach. I would say, given all the problems that Doug Peterson's had this year, you probably wouldn't put him in the top 5. Obviously, Belichick's at the top. Harbaugh's probably up there. But I mentioned that the Seahawks find ways to hurt themselves. I think Zimmer's probably a better coach than Carroll. It's just that Carroll's had a lot more talent and designed a better scheme and then had issues kind of adapting that scheme going forward, which I think is one reason why all of those disciples have had problems producing elsewhere. And the best version of that in San Francisco and Dallas, they've moved away from the scheme. So I would say that Zimmer's probably a top 5 coach. But, after Belichick and Harbaugh, it does become a little bit of a wash. I'd say Andy Reid's probably a better coach than him, but it's good to be in that company. Oh, and then the Cousins part of the question. This year, Cousins is probably 6th or 7th among quarterbacks. It's interesting because the stuff that he's typically good at, he continues to be good at. The stuff that he's typically criticized for, he's been kind of up and down. So you take a look at his 2016 season where he was number 4 in passer rating and number 3 in adjusted yards per attempt and all these other statistics, and nobody really bought into it. They were just yeah, those yards are empty, and the statistics were meaningless, and they didn't win a ton of games, and you couldn't win in the playoffs. And I think some of that criticism is a little bit lazy, but I think some of it made sense because, again, in situational football, he didn't do a lot. He was supported a lot by a supporting cast. Here, I think you take a look at the top quarterbacks. He's not better than Mahomes or Lamar Jackson or Russell Wilson. That's fine. But then you take a look at kind of the next tier of quarterbacks. Phillip Rivers has fallen off. Matthew Stafford's broken, so you can't count him. And then after that, is he better than Aaron Rodgers? That's kind of a weird question, but Rodgers kind of stinks this year.
Yeah, Arif doesn't care how controversial that take is in this room full of Vikings fans. By God.
But yeah, one play you probably pick Rodgers, but I think this season has demonstrated that Cousins can. I mean, it's like Rodgers has like a top 7 receiver, and he's got like the number 2 offensive line by like pass block win rate, and he invites a ton of pressure. He can't get it to other receivers, and it's like, well, I mean, like Cousins has been dealing without Adam Thielen, and he's had like B.C. Johnson and Laquan Treadwell, and it's like, who's to say that they're necessarily better or worse than Marquez Valdez-Scantling or Geronimo Allison or whoever? And Rodgers just hasn't produced as many yards. He hasn't, the situations where they've won have been a lot kind of like the Seahawks winning this year, where they've been in close games and they've had to pull it out by the skin of their teeth and stuff like that. So when you look at like the top, and Brady's kind of regressed too this year. You take a look at that team and you watch Patriots games and you're asking what's wrong with this offense. The defense obviously is pretty phenomenal. And so you're in a weird situation where you say, hey, if we're only looking at this year, yeah, I guess Cousins is better than Brady and Rodgers, which is just such a bizarre thing to say.
We're in the Matrix.
Yeah, we're in the Matrix. Well,
we're beyond the looking glass now.
Well, I mean, the other part of the bizarre thing is that Prescott might be better than all 3 of them. So, like, I don't know. But, yeah, it's a weird spot. But this year, I'd say Cousins is like a top 7-ish quarterback.
So, side note about the Aaron Rodgers thing. So, you remember our conversation last episode when we were talking about who do you bring to Thanksgiving? I got called heartless for mentioning that Aaron Rodgers wouldn't be bringing anybody to the table. I thought that that was a positive. You don't want unexpected guests to come. I got called heartless on Twitter. I mean, this happens to you all the time. What? But like, I
can't imagine why people thought you were insulting the Green Bay Packers quarterback by talking about how he has a bad relationship with his family. I don't see where people saw it.
There was either 2 or 3 comments about that episode. But I think we have a question here.
Yeah.
Should I come over here?
All right, so how many people are actually from living in Seattle right now and have to listen to ESPN 710 radio? Okay, so when they're sitting there all week saying that we're already looking past the Minnesota Vikings, how does that make everybody feel? Because it makes me feel pretty good, actually, for once, going into this game. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's hilarious. So I understand they've got like the 49ers on the schedule, and that's, a bigger game, and fine. But like,
they just want to make Kirk Cousins mad. That's clearly all that there is to it.
We pay somebody to piss Kirk Cousins off.
That's bizarre to me. I don't think the Seahawks probably think that. It's weird because I actually kind of like when I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Brock Huard?
Yeah,
Huard. Normally, I just read some of the stuff he's written. Normally, it's like fine, but when he gets kind of in this weird hot takey zone, it gets kind of eye rolly. I don't know, but yeah, I don't understand why you would, because you're competing for the same wild card spot. Obviously, if the Seahawks win and then they beat the 49ers again, they're in contention for a first-round bye. And in theory, actually, if the Seahawks beat the Vikings hurt their playoff chances but increase their chances of a first-round bye, because the Seahawks, it's weird. But, yeah, so the Seahawks obviously care about that free win in the playoffs. I don't think the Seahawks actually think that. They tend to be a fairly, kind of like PJ Fleck, this is the Minnesota Vikings season. We want to go 1-0 this week. They say the same kind of stuff. So I don't think the Seahawks think that. I can't imagine why Seattle radio would say that. Like, I would hype up this game if I was confident. So if I'm a homer for the Seahawks, which I'm not, I want to clarify. And if I was confident the Seahawks were going to win, I would pump up the Vikings a ton. I'd be like, yeah, if they beat the Vikings, they've crushed another good team. They're on their way to the Super Bowl. It's another late season surge for them. It's great. I don't know why they would say, the Vikings, who is Stephon Diggs? I don't know. I mean, they didn't score any. They scored 6 points last year until the fourth quarter, and it took a pair of turnovers for them to be able to score, much more than that. So this is a worse team than last year. So I don't know why they would think that. But I feel like Vikings fans generally like being the underdog.
I don't know if necessarily like. I feel like it's been thrust upon us.
Well, okay, they're comfortable with being the underdog. Every time someone tweets out power rankings and the Vikings are lower than people think they should be, I get a ton of tweets saying, that's great. People should overlook them. They play better when people overlook them, which sure. I don't know. I don't think that's any truer or false, but fine. But that seems to be the way I've interacted with the Vikings fans on Twitter. They like this idea that no one pays attention to them.
You've gone on record and compared Vikings Twitter to North Korea in a certain respect. In that it makes a lot.
I don't remember this.
It makes a lot of threats, but you have to give it a certain level of respect. And you should never cross the line into its territory.
And only Dennis Rodman can calm it down. Sure.
Kaylin asks, do you think the Vikings will spread things out offensively or play conservative?
I think that they'll play tight formations, but I think they'll take deep shots downfield out of them. They've done this a lot where they have a receiver split tied into the formation. It's usually called a nasty split if they're inside the numbers. And that gives them a lot of, it's basically like having a slot receiver, even if they're the outermost receiver, because it gives them a lot of space to work with. And obviously when you've got route runners like Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, they can take a lot of advantage of that kind of space. So I think they'll play tight. And the advantage of that is that it looks like, a run. It's a run alert. And most teams, when they play tight, run the ball 75% of the time out of that formation. So it gives you better, play action opportunities. So I think they'll be explosive. I don't think they'll play a bunch of three wide. They haven't played a bunch of three wide this year. Plus, if Thielen continues to be kind of an injury concern, there's no reason to play a bunch of three wide. So I think they'll play two tight end sets a lot. It'll look conservative, but I do think they'll pass the ball down the field and try to be explosive. I think that they've done conservative stuff, but usually after they've got a lead. So I think that until they can establish that they've got a pretty good lead, and I wish they would stop deferring. I would love for them to just try and use that first possession. But I think that until they have that lead, they'll probably try and create explosive plays. And then, 2-3 weeks ago, even after they had the lead, they started creating explosive plays. So I think they'll be explosive, but I think it'll look like a conservative offense when they line up.
Chris asked, does Kirk Cousins have a correlation between how much he celebrates on the field and how successful he is on the field? I haven't seen him taking part in any team celebrations since week 3, and he seems to be better for it.
So
that is the oddest.
I like Jordan's doing the dead arm dance over there. So the thing is, so I sit next to Sam Ekstrom of Zone Coverage in the press box, and he actually brought this up, I think around week 5, and he's brought it up every other week since then. Hey, he doesn't celebrate anymore. I wonder if there's a reason for that. Did the team tell him to screw off, or is he taking the CEO thing super seriously?
Kirk just wants to dance. It's
well, he doesn't dance. That's the thing. He goes to the sideline right after a touchdown, and I don't know what it is. I think Sam asked Kirk Cousins hey, so why aren't you celebrating? And he got, I think, the you gotta be the CEO, and you have to maintain the same attitude no matter what happens kind of answer. Which I don't know if you're like first in yards per attempt, do whatever you want, but it is weird.
I have just been waiting for him to like break out the Cabbage Patch or something. he seems that sort of like white toast sort of thing.
I expected him to know one dance and for it to be the robot, but
no, he's got
he's got more range.
He's got the one move from Knocked Up. He's got the shaking of the dice. That's all he's got. Logan asks, has Arif tried the fancy/better turkey key from Binging with Babish this week? Is that a good way to eat a turkey? For those who have not seen this week's Binging with Babish,
it's a monstrosity.
There was an episode. Binging with Babish takes TV and movie foods and then proceeds to make real life versions of them. And I've done a couple of them and they taste really well. However, I will not be doing the full cooked turkey wrapped up and then stuffed into another turkey like you would stuffing.
That comes from How I Met Your Mother.
Yeah, it comes from How I Met Your Mother. And that looked so atrocious. And you'll notice that if you watch the episode, he never actually tastes the turkey.
Right. Yeah, so the biggest problem, according to Babish, is that the half of the turkey that's just sticking out of the other turkey, he gives it a name. I'm not gonna, but that part gets like overcooked, and it's not any good. So no, that would not change my mind on turkey at all. That would reinforce my very strong beliefs that it's a trash meat.
You know, that actually does bring up the question. I know that you were here on, I believe, you tried to get here early morning Wednesday, and
yeah, I got a snow delay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what did you do here for Thanksgiving? Did you just try to get as much like mercury poisoning as you could through seafish, or was it, or did you end up just going to some Denny's off the interstate, hat on, like hood up, I just want the turkey cutlet, and I don't want to ask any questions.
No,
Marb red just hanging off your fingers.
No, I went to the gay bar across the street. Gay bars tend to have Thanksgiving meals because, you know, people get kicked out of their homes and stuff like that, so it's like a tradition. They had no cover. They had a bunch of great food. They have amazing wings. It's a place called Union in Capitol Hill. They only have them on Wednesdays, though, because they sell the wings at cost, so they want you to, like, buy beer and stuff. Yeah, Wing Wednesdays, yeah. I went there for Thanksgiving. It was a lot of fun because it was pretty good food. I did not have the turkey.
I wanted so badly to be like, so I tried it there, and my opinion just completely changed. It was the noise. Life affirming. I called my parents afterwards and said, I'm sorry. They said, who is this? This is a wrong number. Like, it was going to be fantastic. Do we have one or two more questions before we finish up here? I do have a great one to end with, so we'll get one or two questions here.
Okay, this deals with throwing to the left. Who was worse? Was it Mitchell Trubisky or Travaris Jackson? And since Brad Childress is involved in the development of both those quarterbacks, is that just part of his genius?
That's good. I like that. Yeah. I don't have anything to add to the second part of that. That's phenomenal. I guess, at least Travaris Jackson at the Arizona game, right? Like, he has that to his name. I don't know that Trubisky's got like does he have a 4-touchdown game?
You know, I'd actually have to search that one out.
Because he got like 3 touchdowns on Thursday, and that was like the best game he's ever had.
How weird is it that the best game that happened on Thanksgiving was on paper the god-awful Lions-Bears game?
That Purdue quarterback's kind of good. I like him.
That was I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that far more than I should have. I was I was cheering with the family there, going,
They tried to sign Josh Johnson for that game.
Yep.
And they couldn't.
When the XFL says no, apparently you have to adhere to them legally. So
Yeah. Vince McMahon's got, too much weight in this town. Can't cross him. No, but Trubisky's awful. There's not much.
Mitsubishi.
Yeah, Mitsubishi, yeah.
just atrocious. I think we had a question over here if you want to come on up here.
Welcome, guys. Welcome to Seattle. Being an honorary Seahawks Twitter member, which, by the way, we're happy to have you back, I would love to know how you deal with Seahawks fans. We're in enemy territory here. It would be great if you could give us some tips.
They just harass me a lot.
And make fantastic Photoshops.
They're really good at it. Oh, my God. They're like a very online community. It's very uncomfortable. As somebody who's extremely online himself, that's too much.
Is that like when like other smokers tell you to put it out? Like, dude.
This is a daycare, my God. I think probably the best way is to like invest in Supersonics gear. Sean Kemp was really good. Let's see what the problem. Try to connect with that.
Like, do you like this throwback Kevin Durant? Like,
This is back when he was 80 pounds.
that is. Wow. Well, we enjoyed being in Seattle. I don't know if we'll be able to return now, but we did appreciate being in Seattle. Finally, we have a question from Average Aaron who says, if you were able to fist fight a fish from the famous fish catching market in Seattle, what would be your walk-up song?
I don't know, Spoon Man? I don't know. Something.
You'd go pure traditional Seattle.
I'm wearing flannel, right? Something that just doesn't seem like a walk-up song. It would, like, if you wanted to get into a fight, that's like the last song you'd want to listen to. But it's a fish, right? So, what's it gonna do?
Well, I would go with I wouldn't say a lesser-known Seattle person, but somebody that's not necessarily associated as much with Seattle. But he even has a statue here in town, and that would be Jimi Hendrix. I would probably end up going with.
That's too interesting. That's way too good.
You're
gonna waste Jimi Hendrix on a fish fight?
I don't have I don't have many opportunities to have walk-up music for fights. I gotta shoot my shot here. Probably end up having to go Voodoo Child on that, or something like that, just to kind of even up the playing field. Because I don't know, I've seen the blooper reels on YouTube of the fish that don't get caught, or the fish that just hit the person in the face.
Jesus.
So, like, the struggle is real. That is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Arif, what do you have to plug?
I submitted an article this morning to my editor. I don't think it's been published yet, so I got to text him. But it was a preview of the Seahawks game. I talk about the deep ball again because they love throwing the ball deep on the occasion that they do throw the ball, and how much of a challenge it's going to be for the Vikings and kind of how they can adjust their coverage to deal with that. Plus, I had a piece on the way that we use advanced stats to evaluate players and what that means for the Pro Bowl discussion. And that's it. I didn't write a lot because I was traveling to Seattle.
You were too.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So.
You were too busy sitting on a runway wondering when the hell you were going to get up.
Oh my God! The DS the plane like 3 times.
So I was.
Which like good, but like also why?
Which amused me greatly because this morning I was taking off from Fargo and there was ice on the plane. They had to de-ice it, but I showed up easily with 30 seconds left before they were going to shut the gate on it. Because I apparently don't own a watch. So I make it.
You have
I make
a phone?
it. Well, this isn't mine. What are you talking about? So I make it there. I run through. I make it to the airport, and they say that I can't check my bag because it's too late. Like, oh, wonderful. This will go well with the live recording I need to do today. So I end up making it late, and then thanks to the ice on the plane, they were actually able to like jimmy it in and get my luggage in. I was like, oh,
right.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you, hour-long delay for my airplane. Thank you for allowing me to have access to all of my recording gear today.
All right.
Yay. So that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Coming to you live from a place you really should attend if you end up in the Pacific Northwest.
Fantastic.
Welcome to Petoskeys. Thank you guys so much. Petoskeys has been such a fantastic place to work with. Has really done a lot to kind of set up and make us feel at home. We hope you guys out here enjoyed it. Thank you guys so much. And please remember, hold on. For Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for listening. And please remember that as Arif says, revenge is a dish best served funky as hell. And we will see you guys next week. Applause and knowing laughter will be edited in post. It'll be fine. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.